Starting video. Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to this Agile webinar being presented by More Agile and by Lamry. The topic for this afternoon is project managers and their changing role in the Agile world. So what we're going to do is we're going to be looking at some of the ideas that surround agility in projects and how those ideas have an impact on the role of a project manager and how that role is actually going to change in response to the changing behaviours of project teams and of organisations. So if we start by thinking about how project managers are often seen in the real world today, we know that project managers have this perception of being agents of command and control. They're put into a position where they have the responsibility of delivering a project, but very often many aspects of the project work are outside of their direct control. So the only way that project managers can see of controlling risk around the delivery of a project is to actually impose strong control, strong command structures on top of those projects, so that all of the internal risk within the project is being effectively managed, leaving only the external risk, the risk in the environment, the risk in the technology, the risk in the customer, the risk in the suppliers, in terms of the extra stuff that has to be managed on a continuous basis within the project environment. So command and control is very much a reaction to the perceived risk of having the responsibility of delivering a project, but not having enough influence, enough ways to actually manage all the risks in the project. And this has worked historically, of course, because the project manager has very much been seen as being in charge of the project. The project manager is the person who has that responsibility, has the accountability, and is in charge of a project. The problem comes when we start trying to be agile in our organization. So looking at this command and control view in a bit more detail, we see that actually a lot of our responsibilities look inwards towards the team. So we see that the project manager has this overall responsibility for getting the right resources, human resources, technical resources, contract resources, environmental resources, whatever those resources may be, the project manager has the responsibility for getting the right resources onto the project. They are responsible for identifying and making sure that risk is managed effectively across the project. For creating the work breakdown structure, what does the project actually have to do? For scheduling the work of the project, when is the project actually going to deliver the elements of that work breakdown structure? For understanding the progress of the project, how are we doing against our plan? Are we delivering the elements of the work breakdown structure following the schedule that we said we would be following? Alongside monitoring the delivery on time, actually looking at the budget. Are we spending our budget at the right speed? Looking for issues. What is impacting our project today as opposed to risks, which of course are potential future impacts? What's impacting our project today? And what are we going to do in order to actually resolve those issues to make sure that our project continues to deliver smoothly? Looking at training. What skills do we need on our project team? What new skills do we need? Have we got new joiners who need specific training to deliver the project? For actually assigning the work to the team members. And as we go through our project, of course, the one thing we can be sure of is that things are going to change. So how do we actually incorporate that change into our continuing project delivery, into our project plans, into our work breakdown structures, and into our schedules? As well as those inward-looking responsibilities, we also know that we have responsibilities outwards towards the different project stakeholders. So we may be actually responsible for obtaining plan approval. We've done our scheduling, we've created our work breakdown structure, we've got our resources, we have our approach to delivering the project. How do we actually get the stakeholders to approve that plan, to commit to the delivery following that plan? We have responsibilities, at least some of us do, for negotiating the budget related to the project, for making sure that our resources and our schedules match. In other words, our schedule is feasible given the resources and the scope that we're trying to deliver. We have direct responsibility for receiving requests for change and for managing those requests through their life cycle until they're actually approved into the scope of the project or rejected, so that the project knows that it's not going to have to carry those changes out. And of course, we have responsibility, given that we're monitoring our progress and our budget spend, we have responsibility to report our progress and our budget spend out to our external stakeholders. When we identify certain critical risks or specific significant issues, we need to escalate those outside the scope of the project so they could be managed more effectively by the organization as a whole. And finally, we have overall responsibility for meeting management demands as those evolve across the lifetime of the project. And ultimately, our biggest responsibility, if you like, is to make sure the project delivers. And throughout this discussion of responsibility, what I'm talking about, of course, is responsibility is about doing the work. To distinguish that from accountability, which is actually the buck stops here, but I may delegate the responsibility to other people within the project. So this is a view, if you like, of a command and control view of responsibilities held by the project manager in terms of delivering the project. But what we see in many organizations that we work with is increasingly, from a bottom-up point of view, we have the Agilista popular front seizing control of a project. In other words, we have an agile revolution going on inside projects. And I guess the point of this webinar is to look at how some of these key building foundation blocks of Agile are going to have an impact on the project management role. So the key building blocks of Agile that I picked out for discussion this afternoon are around the nature of the team and how that evolves in an Agile world. So in contrast to a traditional project team where we see people working on individual tasks and therefore in general working as individuals, we see that Agile teams try to work in a very collaborative way. So problems as they arise are discussed and resolved corporately within the team. Collaboration within the team is the nature of the game. With collaboration, the team increasingly becomes self-organizing. So that, for example, we see task allocation, task prioritization, the allocation of work, the prioritization of that work within the team being done by the team itself. And this calls into question the responsibilities of the project manager in terms of those types of activities. What does the role of the project manager mean in terms of allocating work if our team is becoming self-organizing? Alongside being collaborative and being self-organizing, we see the team becoming empowered to make critical decisions about the way the project will be implemented, the way the solution that we're building is going to be implemented, working perhaps in collaboration with the project owner or other members of the user community to make critical decisions about the sequencing of tasks, the prioritization of certain features and their implementation, and decisions about the look and feel and technical implementation of those requirements in the project. Most importantly, we see that the team is led in some sense by a role that increasingly is recognized as being a servant leader, somebody who leads the team, but who leads the team by fulfilling these characteristics of being collaborative, of supporting the idea of self-organization, of encouraging the team to be empowered and to make decisions. So this servant leadership, as opposed to the command and control type of leadership that we talked about earlier. So given these changing characteristics, I guess it's interesting to actually revisit that command and control viewpoint and see what aspects of the role are changing in the view of this collaborative, self-organizing, empowered, led by the servant leader type of environment are imposing on that command and control viewpoint. So here's the same slide that we saw just now, and we're going to click through this a step at a time, seeing how some of these key responsibilities change. Getting the right resources. Well, in my view, this is one responsibility that does, to some extent at least, remain aligned with the project manager, if only because the project manager is very often still the first person in post on a project. So in terms of getting the project started, at the very least, the project manager has responsibility to the team to make sure those right resources are obtained. During the lifetime of a project, that responsibility is retained, because the team may identify the need for more resources, but actually identifying the available resources and making sure they find their way onto the project probably still remains with the project manager. But if we begin to think about identifying and managing risk, well, if we have a self-organizing team who are taking responsibility for the allocation of work within the team, then it's very likely that the identification of risk to do with that work is going to arise within the team itself. In other words, what we're seeing is responsibility for the identification and for the management of risk is becoming internal to the team itself. And so the responsibility of the project manager is actually now being transformed into an accountability. The project manager takes on the task of encouraging the team to identify risk and to manage its own risk, but without doing that management, without doing that identification themselves. So the responsibility that we identified earlier in the control and command viewpoint is changed into an accountability, with the responsibility being moved down into the project team. Similarly, when we think about creating a work breakdown structure and scheduling the work of a project, again, we have a self-organizing team. The nature of self-organization is that the team makes its own decisions, perhaps working with the product manager, product owner, I beg your pardon, perhaps working with users. The team makes its own decisions in terms of the prioritization of the work involved in the project and who is actually going to be doing that work. So the scheduling and the work breakdown structure itself are now very much within the responsibility of the team. Again, the project manager has an accountability to make sure that the project has an effective work breakdown structure. So what does that work breakdown structure look like? Well, in the Agile world, it probably looks like a bunch of stories. And if we have a good definition of done, then we can use the definition of done to drive out the more detailed tasks within each individual story in that work breakdown structure. So we can think about our work breakdown structure as being the set of stories that we're delivering and the tasks within those stories driven by our definition of done. So the project manager actually has a mechanism for helping them to confirm that the project has an effective work breakdown structure. Am I seeing a work breakdown structure that reflects the stories in the current sprint? And for each of those stories, am I seeing an effective task structure based on the definition of done? Recording progress information and monitoring budget spend. Again, these are still very much in the remit of the project manager. Of course, on our Agile project, we will see the daily stand-up meetings, we will see the burn down chart being used to track delivered effort, we will see the burn up chart being used to track delivered scope. But the chances are the project manager actually has to report that information to external stakeholders in a different viewpoint. The organization probably has standardized reporting templates, reporting formats, and reporting structures. So the project manager still has the responsibility of taking that information and being produced in the daily stand-up meetings and turning it into a form that can actually be reported outside the organization, outside the project organization. In terms of managing issues, again, in exactly the same way as risks are now internalized within the project teams, the identification and the management of risk internalized in the project team, we see that issue identification and resolution is increasingly managed by the self-organizing, by the empowered team. The team becomes responsible for identifying those issues as they arise, but it also becomes responsible for identifying the best approach to resolving the issue and for actually allocating those corrective actions to members within the team. And of course, also for making sure those corrective actions are integrated into the work breakdown structure as additional tasks, either to be carried out within this current sprint, if the prioritization of those tasks is high enough, or perhaps in a future sprint, if the prioritization of those tasks moves them down the priority list. Identifying necessary training. As a self-organized, empowered team, we can identify the skills we're lacking. We can identify the skills we need to acquire. Training is part of skills acquisition, so we can be responsible for identifying the training. We may, of course, escalate that responsibility back to the project manager in terms of identifying suitable courses and getting those courses scheduled. But for identifying the need for the training in the first place, that very much sits within the Agile team. Assignment of tasks and actions we've talked about. The very nature of self-organization and empowerment is to say that the assignment of tasks and actions lies within the responsibility of the team. Again, the project manager retains the accountability for making sure that the right tasks and the right actions and the right elements of the work breakdown structure are assigned during the current sprint. That remains an accountability of the project manager, but the responsibility moves down into the project team. Thinking about incorporating change, this again moves down to become a responsibility of the project team. Working with the product owner, the project team can decide on the prioritization of change and therefore effectively which sprint each change is going to come within. So the actual incorporation of change into our plans very much delegates itself down into the Agile project. So what we can begin to see here is that the responsibility, the command and control type of responsibility of the project manager transforms itself much more into a set of accountabilities, with those responsibilities moving downwards into the project team. And the project manager is much more moving into this role of part of the servant leadership role. The servant leadership role, therefore, might be shared. So in the Scrum community, you have the concept of the Scrum Master, somebody who is expert in the processes, the techniques, the ideas of Agile project delivery. Sitting alongside that, as part of the servant leadership role, you have the project manager who takes the outputs of the team in terms of their priorities, their task planning, their risk identification, their burn down charts, and uses that information to actually consolidate the project plan and keep the overall project plan up to date and report that information outwards to the external stakeholder panel. So what we see is that the responsibilities outwards towards the stakeholders change much less than the inward-looking responsibilities. At least that's true as the organization begins to adopt Agile, begins to climb the roadmap to being fully Agile across the organization. So why is it that we are retaining these outward-looking responsibilities whilst we transform the inward-looking responsibilities much more into accountabilities? Well, very simply, it's because the rest of your organization isn't becoming Agile, at least it's not becoming agile yet. So what we see is that in terms of the way the project has to interface to the rest of the organization, this still doesn't look very agile. And in many organizations that we work with, we see projects trying to interface to a project office that is not agile. So the project office is asking for information with a heartbeat, and fundamentally the structure of that information and the heartbeat do not really suit the needs of an agile project. So the project manager has this responsibility to the project office to take the information, the burn down charts, the burn up charts being produced by the agile project team, and turn that into a form acceptable to the project office, and do that with a frequency, with the heartbeat being imposed on them by the project office. And that can be a complex task. Similarly, working with the finance department, finance wants to know about budget spend. Again, as we deliver the Agile project, it may not be producing the information about budgetary spend in the form that's required by the finance department. So as a project manager, we have the responsibility for taking the financial information being produced by the project team and turning that into the form required by the finance office. Two other organizations within the overall organization that we may have difficulties with, in particular, are human resources. Agile teams need to be dynamic, need to change, need to respond to change in a very dynamic way. That suggests we may need to bring human resources on to the project in pretty short order. Yet we know that human resources are not that great in many organizations at responding to those sudden types of changes. So again, the project team manager has this key responsibility for working with human resources to make sure they deliver any change in the resource profile that we need within the time scale that we need it. And a similar set of problems exists with supplier management. If our project is going to be working with suppliers to deliver certain key aspects of our Agile project, perhaps certain components of the solution that we're going to be deploying, then we need to think about how we get those agreements with the suppliers in place in the right timescale. How we actually make sure that our interface to the supplier is actually an Agile interface, when probably our supplier management department has been used to delivering waterfall style contracts, command and control style type contracts. So how are we going to change the nature of those contracts? How are we going to get them in place on time? And how are we going to actually work with the supplier management team to manage that contract in an Agile way? All of these are challenges being faced by the Agile project manager. And what we see here is that actually the role of the Agile project manager is changing to be something that is much more interesting and much more challenging. We're moving away from the command and control viewpoint that we've had in the traditional project environment, and we're transitioning ourselves into this challenging environment of having to nurture our Agile project team inside this organization, which itself is fundamentally not Agile. And overcoming those challenges is actually much more interesting than just the traditional command and control ass-kicking exercise around making sure the project delivers on time. So this change of environment is a real challenge for many project managers as they move into the Agile world. And it can be very helpful as we make this transition to think about the interface that we're going to be working with. And I see two key roles being involved in this interface. Notice I talked about roles and not people. It may well be that both roles are played by the same person. But equally, there's nothing to stop the two roles being played by different people in the organization. And I'll talk about some of the different characteristics of these two roles as we go through this slide. So if we think about the project manager and what we're calling here the iteration lead may be a scrum master, but increasingly as we find agile project teams becoming more mature, what we see is that the iteration lead is just another member of the team. They may change, they may rotate the iteration lead role sprint by sprint by sprint. But if we look at these two roles, the project manager has key outward-looking responsibilities to all of the different stakeholders of the project, all of the different external stakeholders of the project. The iteration lead, in contrast, has very few outward-looking responsibilities. Mainly because, of course, our agile team is behaving in a self-organizing and collaborative way. So those outward-looking responsibilities are shared across the team. When we talk about working with the product owner, that work is managed in a collaborative way. It's the whole team that is typically collaborating with the product owner. If we look at the inward-looking view of the interface, we have already seen that the project manager now has inward-looking accountabilities. They're accountable for making sure that risk management is done, that risk scheduling is done, that task allocation is done. But the responsibility for doing that is held jointly by the collaborative, empowered, self-organizing team. In contrast, the iteration lead carries many inward-looking responsibilities. They are the lead for at least the current iteration, for at least the current sprint. They carry those responsibilities for enabling the team to deliver within that sprint, within that iteration. The project manager is typically appointed by the stakeholders. The iteration lead in immature teams may also be appointed by the stakeholders, but increasingly as the team moves towards maturity, we see that the iteration lead is appointed by the team, and that role may rotate on a regular basis. Project managers are typically at least stable across the project, very often static across the project, the same project manager staying in post across the project duration. But in contrast, what we see is the iteration lead, as the team again moves towards maturity in the agile world, the iteration lead actually changing regularly. And of course, that's highly desirable because we don't want any one member of the team to carry that overall responsibility across the lifetime of the project. The project manager is communicating constantly outwards towards the external stakeholders of the project, and their primary channel of communication inwards is to the iteration lead. In contrast, the iteration lead communicates outward to the project manager and also outward to the product owner. Their inwards communication is handled simply because they are a member of a project team. They are continuously collaborating with the other members of the project. The project manager can be a member of the team, but what we do see is the project manager, because of their outward-looking role, typically cannot be a full member of the team. So they kind of have one foot inside the Agile team that allows them to collaborate with the team when they have to collaborate, but they also have one foot outside of the Agile team, and that allows them to keep abreast of their responsibilities to the external stakeholders. In contrast, the iteration lead is a full member of the Agile team. They fully participate in the collaborative work of the team. So here are the two key roles involved in the interface between the external world, the external stakeholders, and the project. This interface being mediated by two key roles, the project manager and the iteration lead. We see this as being typically most effectively delivered when we have two key people involved, one playing the role of project manager, the other playing the iteration lead role, with, of course, the iteration lead rotating through members of the team when the team achieves a degree of agile maturity. So, thinking about outward accountability, we can ask the question, who has the overall accountability for the delivery of the project? And to me, this is really a key change. What we see is in the context of the project, but it's the actual Agile team that has the overall accountability for the delivery of the project. The accountability for the delivery of a project no longer rests with the project manager, it rests with the Agile team. And in as far as the project manager has at least 1 foot inside the Agile team, then they share in that accountability, of course. There's another question we can ask, because there's another role. If you think about the typical product that a project is helping to deliver, then that product evolves over a number of projects. So if we say that the Agile project team has accountability for the delivery of a single project, we can ask a second meaningful question, which is, who then has the accountability for the delivery of the product across multiple projects? And of course, that accountability lives with the product owner. So within the context of a project and a set of features to be delivered in a project, the product owner is effectively delegating the accountability for the delivery of those features down to the project team. But the accountability for the delivery of the overall product rests and remains with the product owner. So we've painted this picture of an Agile project existing inside an organization which is fundamentally not Agile. But what we begin to see in many organizations that make a success of Agile projects is that actually those ideas begin to pervade more widely across the rest of the organization. We see that as Agile projects are successful, some of the ideas around collaboration begin to pervade into other parts of the organization. For example, we know that it's essential that the Agile team and the product owner collaborate with each other. If the product owner is a member of the user community, they begin to see the benefits of this type of collaboration. So they begin to work in more collaborative ways with their own segment of the organization. As collaboration increases, we see change response improving, so that as we receive a change request from a product owner and we feed information about that change request back to the product owner, they collaborate with their own people, and their response to that change also modifies, becomes more effective, improves over time. As we see this improving response to change, we see that levels of trust improve between different parts of the organization. So that as the product owner begins to believe in the Agile project teams, the trust between the product owner and the user department and those Agile teams becomes more pervasive. The use of information radiators, so information on walls, big pictures on walls, proliferates across the organization, and increasing numbers of stakeholders come and consult that information rather than relying on reports being issued by the project manager. So this wide consultation begins to build on this picture of sharing information. And what we see is this idea of agility spreading out from the project teams across the rest of the organization as the rest of the organization sees the effectiveness of these ideas. And in the light of those changes, what we begin to see is increasing separation of this idea of external responsibility from internal accountability. The way that we reflect that across the organization is in this concept of adaptive management. the idea that adaptive management spreads itself across the organization. So what is this concept of adaptive management? So here we see, I've taken the diagram from the previous slide where the project manager still had those responsibilities looking outwards to the other parts of the organization. Those other parts being separated from the project team. And what we've tried to do with the picture on this slide is to show that as agility increases, those other departments move closer to our project teams and to each other. And in particular, what we see is that the collaboration between those parts of the organization increases markedly. So what we're beginning to see now is an agile context across the whole of the organization, reflected in continuous adaptation across the organization, self-organizing teams in all of these different parts of the organization. So this concept of adaptive management is very people-centric. We are looking for empowered, self-organizing teams collaborating across the organization. So what are management doing in this picture of an adaptive organization? Management become responsible for setting vision and goals and retain the accountability for the delivery of those vision and goals. But the responsibility for the delivery of the vision, the responsibility for the delivery of the goals is delegated downwards to these self-organizing, collaborating, empowered teams. And in these teams, what we see, because they are being made responsible for delivery of these goals, is they remain flexible. That's the nature of self-organization. But they also inculcate within themselves discipline and rigor in order to make sure that they deliver the vision and goals being set for them by the management team of the organization. This, of course, is a very motivating environment. If I have clear responsibilities, but those responsibilities are genuinely mine, and I can collaborate and self-organize the way that the work is done, then that's a very motivational environment in which to work. But because of the rigor that we're using to deliver the goals, we also see increases in disciplines within the team. So the whole organization begins to move up this spectrum away from command and control towards collaboration, towards empowerment, towards self-organization, and ultimately towards the achievement of high performance across the entire organization. How can we help? So, More Agile is collaborating with an international organization called the International Consortium for Agile, or ICAgile. And in the UK, we are delivering the ICAgile accredited training. The ICAgile accredited training looks at an organization and says, actually, the problem of delivering agility into our organization is much bigger than just delivering the ability to deliver all agile projects within teams. We need to understand how agility impacts other roles in the organization, the project management role, the business analyst role, the external stakeholder role, the value management role, the PMO. All of these roles in the organization are impacted by different aspects of Agile. So within ICAgile, we see a number of different learning streams that focus on these different roles in the organization. In the context of today's webinar, I would suggest there are 3 streams that are of interest. Agile Fundamentals focuses on introducing Agile concepts to any person within the organization, including Agile project teams. Agile Project Management focuses on introducing techniques of Agile project management to project managers who are interested in understanding more deeply how their role is going to change in the Agile world. And the adaptive management learning stream focuses on taking some of those ideas and expanding them into the organizational context so that we can begin to see exactly how the organization itself can change and how we can lead organizations as they become more agile. All of these training courses, I beg your pardon, lead to certified professional status, and they are part of a pathway towards certified expert status. So you actually gain internationally recognized certifications in agile techniques and agile ideas. And all of the courses also contribute PMI professional development units. So if your organization is part of a PMI, then these courses will count towards your continuing professional development needs. So to summarize this afternoon's webinar, what we've seen is that actually agility represents a challenge to project managers. But the change to agility is actually a real positive opportunity for project managers. It encourages project managers to move out of their comfort zone, if you will, around the command and control type of approach to project management, into a much more challenging role of stakeholder management, managing the relationships to the external stakeholders in the organization. And this change is driven by the key agile principles of collaboration within the team, self-organization across the team, empowerment of the team, and servant leadership, so that no one person in the team carries overall authority any longer. The drive towards agility can all too easily be constrained by the relationships to the external stakeholders, the relationships to the rest of the organization. And this is the essence of the challenge that the Agile project manager has to look after. But what we do see is if Agile projects are successful in the organization, increasingly organizations become interested in the ideas that underpin that agility. So we see this concept of adaptive management spreading out across the organization, becoming pervasive in more agile organizations. Adaptive management focusing on leadership setting vision, setting goals for delivery, but those vision and goals being delivered by self-organizing, empowered, collaborative teams across the whole of the organization. That pretty much concludes what I want to say this afternoon. I guess some of you are going to have some questions and answers. I've got you all on mute, and I'm going to keep you on mute. If you would like, please, to use the chat capability, send me a question using chat. I will read the question back to the rest of the audience of the webinar, and then I will do my best to respond to the question. So we'll keep the webinar open for at least another 5 minutes. Please do send in your questions using chat, and I will do my best to respond. Okay, it doesn't seem that there are any questions out there, unless something appears in the next 30 seconds while I'm still speaking. It simply remains for me to, oh, hang on. We have a question from Philip Buchanan. If the work breakdown structure becomes the responsibility of the team, how do project management artifacts get planned, managed, and delivered? For example, plans. Generally, Scrum teams are very good at managing the technical work, but not so much the external plans. Thank you, Philip. That's a very good question. Remember, one of the concepts that I talked about was the idea that actually the project manager has, in a sense, a foot in both camps. So having a foot inside the project team gives them access, if you like, to the backlog of the project team. Having a foot outside of a project team gives them these key responsibilities to make sure that the project management things get delivered to those external stakeholders. So if we take the view that the backlog of a project has to include everything that the project has to deliver, logically that must include the things that the project manager is also responsible for delivering. So my view would be quite simply that it's the project manager's responsibility, wearing their one foot inside the project team hat, that says these tasks must be inside the work breakdown structure. I guess it's possible that there are some of those tasks that the project manager may actually collaborate with the rest of the project team in delivering. So the project manager may collaborate with the team and enlist for help with the project team in delivering some of the work implied by those project management type tasks. That would, of course, dilute the effort that's available to the delivery of the technical tasks of the team. So I guess some caution would have to be exercised around that. My view would very much be the backlog of the project should be the one source of truth in terms of the work the project is planning. If it's going to be the one source of truth, then those non-technical aspects, those project management aspects of the work need to be included in the backlog just as much as any other aspect. Thank you for the question. Okay, from Rob Rees. Rob Rees says, I guess that you're proposing changing part of the definition of accountable. If you accept that only one person can be accountable, whereas several people can be responsible. You can't have a team that is accountable. The Agile team being accountable for delivery of a project doesn't give accountability, particularly if your customer stakeholders are not working in Agile. I guess that a big part of all this is there's a big difference between working internally in an Agile way and working with customers in an Agile way. If customers aren't Agile, this can be limiting. Okay, thank you, Rob. That's a very good point. You're absolutely right. Some type of corporate accountability, by which I mean accountability shared amongst a group, can be a recipe for disaster. And I think that's why having a clearly identified iteration lead is still vitally important, because in terms of who sits in front of some of the stakeholders when something isn't going too well, then I guess we are talking about the iteration lead in that context. I would still stick by the argument that in terms of the overall accountability for the delivery of a project, that is a shared accountability. And that's reflected in the way that we would advocate the iteration lead rotates across the different sprints or iterations of the project. So that in that sense, even if it's only one at a time, the overall accountability is still being shared. In a sense, I guess you can say perhaps maybe there are different levels of accountability. And remember, I reflected back to you the idea that accountability for the product is still held by the product owner. If the accountability for the product is held by the product owner, then in a sense they have delegated part of that accountability to the project team for the delivery of the features inside that project. So maybe there are different aspects to this accountability. One is across a number of projects, we need to make sure that tranches of functionality are delivered. groups of features are delivered in different projects. Once we've decided what a group of features is going to look like, what a given project is going to have within its scope, subject to change during the project, of course, then we're delegating that accountability down to the project team for the delivery of that project within its overall time box. Of course, we know that in the Agile world that accountability is a flexible thing because the scope of the project can change as we go through the project. That's the essence of Agile project management, is to say, actually, we have a time box, we deliver the highest priority stuff first. The lower priority stuff can always drop out at the back end of the project, or at least be renegotiated as the project continues. So the success of an Agile project is different from the success of a more control and command type of project where you are bound by the iron triangle. We at least, if we're being genuinely Agile, have some control over our scope. You raise the interesting point of, am I delivering internally or am I delivering to customers? One of the problems that we see in many organizations before they become truly Agile is that contracts to deliver projects are still being negotiated in a waterfall context. That, of course, rebinds the project into the iron triangle, and that represents a significant challenge, and I don't want to underestimate that challenge. Interestingly, one of the things that ICAgile talks about is there's a stream of education around contract management for Agile, and ICAgile works with a number of other organizations to deliver well-structured Agile contracts. And if that stuff is of interest to you, then we can provide some background on that material outside of the scope of this webinar. Please email us if that's of interest to you. Okay, quite a few people have now dropped off the webinar, and not surprisingly, we've reached the end of the time slot. It doesn't look like there are any more questions, so my thanks to those of you who have asked questions. I will leave the webinar open for a few moments with the contact screen. If any of you have any questions that occur to you after the webinar, please do feel free to email me, and I will do my best to respond to you after the webinar. Thank you very much for your attention this afternoon. On behalf of More Agile and of Lamry, thank you very much. Good afternoon.